everyone. Welcome to sj's classes. This is my second lecture on Mario Klarer and his work An Introduction to Literary Studies. In the previous video lesson, I gave you a brief introduction to both the author and his book, and I also discussed the two important genres, or rather, I discussed the first part of the very first genre that he discusses, which is poetry. So before we begin today's session, let me just sum up everything that we discussed in the previous session so that you can connect it with whatever that you learn today. So as you know by now, Mario Klarer is an associate professor working with the University of Innsbruck, which is in Austria. And this particular book, titled An Introduction to Literary Studies, it provides a beginner of English literary studies with a comprehensive survey of literature. He discusses all the important genres like poetry, fiction, film, and he even gives us some guidelines to doing research and research writing. And the pages or the genres that I will discuss as part of my video lessons will be the genres poetry and drama. And we began with poetry in the previous session. Clara begins by pointing out how ancient this particular art form is. But in spite of this tradition that it has, it's very difficult to define this particular genre. Clara traces back the origin of the word poetry, and he states that it came from the Greek word poio, which means to make or to create. And this makes the poet a creator, a maker of words. Most traditional attempts to define poetry, or traditionally it has been defined, poetry has been defined by placing it side by side with prose. Poetry was defined in a way which puts forth its differences from the prose. So always the attempts have been to differentiate poetry from prose. Clara can't find a definition that defines poetry by treating it as something or treating it in isolation, something which can stand by itself. And majority of these definitions are limited to characteristics like verse, meter, and rhyme. So this is what we confronted at the very outset of the previous session. Then we came to the subdivisions of poetry, which are narrative and lyric poetry. And narrative consists of long epic poems, romances, and ballads. Lyric are rather short poetry and they focus on one particular event or idea or impression. So that is the basic difference between lyric poetry and narrative poetry. Then Clara goes on to elaborate on the precursors of modern poetry, which he believes that can be found in Old English riddles and charms. He quotes the example of the charm against a wen to substantiate his argument. Then he points out that the next stage of development of poetry lies in the use of music as a medium. And that is where we saw the example of cuckoo song or summer is acumen in. And it is only later that we find forms like poetic forms like elegy, ode, and sonnet. Then we came to the discussion of various elements of poetry. That is where we saw the concept of image or imagery. And Clara spends or he describes at length about the those characteristic features which gives concreteness to poetry. And he identifies three levels, and these three levels are lexical thematic dimension, we have the visual dimension, and we also have the rhythmic acoustic dimension. And it's aspects that we confront in these three dimensions that give or ascribe concreteness to poetry. And we discussed the lexical thematic dimension, and we discussed diction, rhetorical figure, and theme under this particular head. Or rather, we concentrated on diction and rhetorical figures. And it's as part of diction that we found that even though you are discussing an abstract idea like human transitoriness in Thomas Gray's elegy, you can use concrete nouns, you can use concrete words to describe that particular abstract idea or entity. So in that way you can give concreteness to poetry. Then you can use images. Images can even become symbols. I gave you the example of cross. It can be treated as two wooden pieces, or it can be treated as something which has meaning beyond that particular level. And then we came to the use of rhetorical figures or figures of speech in poetry. We specifically saw two figures of speech which are used by majority of the poets, and they are metaphor and simile. I gave you the example of Robert Burns' poem A Red Red Rose, in which we have the line, "Oh, my love is like a red red rose." And there you have an example for a simile. If he had said that my love is a red rose, then the poetical or the rhetorical or the figure of speech that he employed would have been metaphor. So we differentiated between what is simile and what is metaphor. And finally, we came down to this movement called Imagism, which was popular during the early part of 20th century. And it's in this particular context that we come across names like Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, etc. So that is where we stopped last class. Now let's as we saw how concreteness is brought to poetry through the use of diction and rhetorical figures. We have understood that from my previous session. Now let us analyze how the visual dimension of poetry helps in achieving this particular quality. So we have three levels. We have the lexical thematic level, we have the visual level, and finally you come to the acoustic rhythmic level. So we did away with the lexical thematic level, that is where we discussed diction and rhetorical figures, and now we come to the visual dimension. So while imagery in traditional poetry revolves around a transformation of objects into language, concrete poetry takes a further step toward visual art, concentrating on poems' shape or visual appearance. So this might be something which is very new to you. What is poem's shape? What do you mean by poem's shape or the visual appearance of a poem? So normally you might have read poems, you might have come across poems which are divided into stanzas, but you might have rarely confronted poems which are arranged in a particular way, or words in a poem are arranged in a particular way so that it assumes a shape. Now, if you can see on the screen, this is one such poem. The poem is titled Easter Wings and it's written by George Herbert. So I have placed it in the landscape mode so that you can interpret the image, the visual image that the poem actually gives us. So it seems like a bird which has spread out its wings to fly. And the title of the poem is Easter Wings. So the words have been arranged in such a way that it gives a visual appearance. And meaning can be deciphered from this particular shape or this particular visual imagery that the poem offers. Now, yet another example would be another poem written by George Herbert, and it's titled Altar. So as you can see on the screen, uh, the words have been arranged in a particular manner so that the poem itself forms an altar. You get the picture of an altar from the poem itself. So this is how a poem concentrates on the visual appearance. This is how meaning is conveyed through visual appearance. So please don't be under the impression that it's just the words that give meaning when you read poetry. Don't be under the impression that it's just the rhetorical figures that give us the meaning. And also don't be under the impression that it's just the lexical or thematic dimension that can attribute concreteness to poetry. Now, poems like Easter Wings and The Altar, it enhances the meaning or the idea that it tries to convey by assuming a particular shape. And Herbert's poem, Easter Wings and the Altar, conveys a visual as well as a verbal image. So, with respect to Easter Wings, it gives us the shape of a bird that is ready to fly. And with respect to the poem The Altar, it gives us the verbal image of an altar. And how has it been created? The poet has constructed it from parts which probably he believed, the poet believed, that have been given to him by God, and perhaps that is how this poem becomes a tribute to God as well. He believes that these words have been given to me by God, and that is why he made the poem into something sort of a tribute for the God. And the building blocks of both Easter Wings and the altar are the words. And what George Herbert does is, he arranges those words in the form of a wings and also in the form of an altar. I can even suggest another poem with which can be you can further look up in on we can you can further look up online, and that is E. Cummings' poem A Leaf Falls. And this particular poem depicts the falling of a leaf, and this can prove the point that is in discussion. So I quoted three poems to show that even visual appearance of a poem can contribute to the concreteness of a poem, or it can even attribute concreteness to a particular work of art. The three poems are Easter Wings and The Altar by George Herbert, and also E. Cummings' poem A Leaf Falls. So these examples show traditional and experimental poetry often work with the pictorial aspects of language and writing, or aim at combining these aspects. So we have this combination, this clubbing of different elements happening in experimental poetry. So we have attempts to turn a poem into a quasi-material. What is meant by quasi-material? Something which has the appearance of a material. So when you read George Herbert's Altar, it actually resembles the altar, the material that we are talking about, the object, the thing that we are talking about. So we have attempts to make poetry into something which is quasi-material, and it can be achieved not only on a thematical level through the use of concrete nouns or scenes, but also on the visual level through a particular layout of letters, words, or stanzas. So what Clara means by this is that it's not just the words or the figures of speech that you employ in a particular poem that matters, that gives it concreteness, that makes it concrete poetry. Even the way in which you arrange the words or letters of a poem can contribute towards it. Okay, now then let's move to the third dimension, which is rhythmic acoustic dimension. And this is where we discuss both rhyme and meter. Rhyme is not something which is new to you, perhaps meter is, and probably you want to listen to me very attentively in that particular part. So to achieve concrete quality of poetic language, sound and tone are employed as elements with their own levels of meaning. By choosing certain words in a line or stanza, a poet can produce a sound or tone which is directly related to the content of the statement. So, when you blindly write a poem without any idea of poetry or the technicalities behind a poem, you might simply end up with a loose poem. But when you have an idea regarding the technicalities, now you can write or you can incorporate words, or to use a technical term, your diction can be such that the sound and tone that you create by using those words can actually relate the readers to the content or the statement that you are trying to make. The acoustic elements, like a poem's visual appearance in concrete poetry, can enhance the meaning of a poem. So, along with diction, along with rhetorical figures, along with the visual appearance of a poem, even the acoustic elements like rhyme and meter can also enhance the meaning of a poem. Meter and rhyme are devices in the acoustic dimension. So I had pointed out this earlier. We have three levels, or rather, Clara identifies three levels. We have the lexical, thematical dimension. That is where we confronted diction. That is where we confronted rhetorical figures. Then we have the visual dimension. That is where we discuss George Herbert's poems, The Easter Wings and Altar, as examples to prove the point or to substantiate the argument that even the visual appearance can contribute towards the meaning of a poem, or it can give concreteness to the poetic language. And now we have come down to the acoustic dimension, and it's in this rhythmic acoustic dimension that we confront ideas like rhyme and meter. So, meter and rhyme are devices in the acoustic dimension of poetry which hold a dominant position in the analysis of poems, partly because they are relatively easy to objectify and measure. So, this is why we focus more on meter and rhyme. It's easier to find out rather than finding out why the visual dimension or visual aspect of the poem enhances the meaning, or how a particular rhetorical figure has enhanced the meaning. It's very easier to identify the meter and the rhyme, and thereby how these aspects contribute towards the meaning of the poem. The smallest elements of meter are syllables, which can be either stressed or unstressed. So we have both stressed and unstressed syllables appearing in poetical verses. And the combination of these stressed, unstressed syllables determine the meter of a particular line. According to the sequence of stressed and unstressed syllables, it is possible to distinguish between various metrical feet whose number consequently indicates the meter. So we have passed into the technical aspects of language. Meter is a bit technical. Please understand that the smallest elements are the syllables, and syllables can be stressed or unstressed. Uh, when you say the word deprive, you know where the stress falls in that particular word, deprive. So now stress means when you emphasize a particular syllable. So according to the combination of stressed and unstressed syllables, now it is possible to distinguish various metrical feet. So let's see some of the important feet that are there in English poetry. The very first is iambus or iambic foot, and the combination of syllables that you find in this particular feat or foot is an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. So this is what you find in iambic feat. You have unstressed syllable and then you have a stressed syllable. If you have two unstressed syllables followed by one stressed syllable, then that meter of foot is called anapest or anapestic foot. Now, I'm not going into the details because you just need to have an idea regarding, or you need to have this understanding that a particular line in poem can be written using a meter or using a foot. And foot or feet in poetry simply refers to the combination of syllables, the stressed and unstressed syllables in poem or in a poetical verse. So when you have an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, that is called iambic foot. When you have two unstressed syllables followed by one stressed syllable, it's anapaestic. Then you have trochee or trochaic foot, in which a stressed syllable is followed by an unstressed syllable. And then finally you have dactylic foot, wherein which you have one stressed syllable followed by two unstressed syllables. So stress, don't confuse, or you don't need to have any misunderstanding regarding stress. Stress happens when you emphasize a particular syllable, and there are syllables in a word which you don't stress. Examination, examination. Where do you put the stress? Examination. So just try to identify the syllable in which you put the stress. So even in poetry, it happens. You stress a particular syllable. So we have different meters of feet depending upon the combination of stressed and unstressed syllable. And the four most important feet are iambic, anapaestic, trochaic, and dactylic. And according to the number of feet, it is possible to distinguish between monometer, dimeter, trimeter, tetrameter, pentameter, and so on. Now, to give you an I think I should give you an example to make this particular concept clear to you. Um, the most popular example that everyone quotes, and even Klarer has quoted in his particular work, is Thomas Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. The very first line of the poem reads like this: "The curfew tolls the knell of the parting day." Now, when you divide it into syllables, this is how you get it. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. You have 10 syllables in it, which means you have 5 feet. And 5 feet means it is in the iambic pentameter mode. And this is how you identify the feet and meter. So according to the number of feet, it is possible to divide poetry or poetical verse into monometer, dimeter, trimeter, tetrameter, pentameter, and so on. So, as I said earlier, the first line of Thomas Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard consists of 5 iambic feet. 5 iambic feet means you have 10 syllables in it, and therefore it is termed iambic pentameter. And one thing that I would like to point out here is that iambic pentameter is the one that which is closest to the rhythm of natural speech. And therefore, this particular form is popular when you come to poetry and drama. And another popular meter in English is iambic hexameter, which is also called the Alexandrine. So, a few terms for you to remember. We have something called syllables in poetry, and you have both stressed and unstressed syllables in poetical lines. The combination of these syllables, stressed and unstressed syllables, determine the feet. You have 4 popular or important feet in English, which are the iambic, anapaestic, trochaic, and dactylic. And the combination or the feet determines the meter. And an elegy written in a country churchyard is an example I cited to give you an example regarding a particular feet or a particular meter. In case of Thomas Gray's elegy, he has employed the iambic pentameter. So we discussed meter. Now we have to come to rhyme. Alongside meter, rhyme adds to the dimension of sound and rhythm in a poem. It is possible to distinguish internal, end, and I rhymes. So 3 terms that you need to understand. You have an idea regarding rhyme. and it's possibly end rhymes. You take the last words of each line and try to compare the sounds, and you arrive at a particular rhyme and rhyming scheme. So you have an idea regarding end rhyme. So what are internal and I rhymes? EYII rhymes. Internal rhymes are alliteration and assonance. This is where you come across yet another rhetorical figure or rhetorical figures, alliteration and assonance. Alliteration is the repetition of the same consonant at the beginning of words in a single line. Now, alliteration and assonance would have been much easier for you to understand if you had an idea regarding vowels and consonant sounds in English language. I'm not sure if you have an idea regarding that. Let me give you a general view on it. We have 44 sounds in English language, and out of that 20 are vowel sounds and 24 are consonant sounds. We have vowel sounds like a as in apple. We have vowel sounds like e as in eat. Then we also have diphthongs. Diphthongs are also vowels. We have I sound as in cry. We have ow sound as in how. So we have combination of sounds which are called diphthongs. We also have individual sounds which are called monophthongs or pure vowels. So we have 12 monophthongs or pure vowels, and we have 8 diphthongs or vowel glides, and in total we have 20 vowel sounds. And then we come to consonants. We have consonants like p, b, t. These are all consonant sounds. There are 24 consonant sounds in English language. So when you have consonant sounds being repeated at the beginning of words in a single line, that is called alliteration. To give you an example, round and round, the rugged rock, the rugged rascal ran. So you have the r sound being repeated there. Let me give you the line once again. Round and round the rugged rock, the ragged rascal ran. So you have r sound being repeated there in the beginning of the words. And this particular technique or the device that has been employed here is alliteration. And what is assonance? If a vowel is repeated instead, it is called assonance. Let me give you an example. Thou foster child of silence and slow time. This particular line has been taken from John Keats' poem Ode on a Grecian Urn. And the line goes like this: Thou foster child of silence and slow time. Child, silence, time. There is one particular diphthong that is common to all these words. That is the diphthong I. Child, you have the I sound coming there in the second position. Silence, again you have the I sound repeating there. And again in the word time, after the first sound, t sound, you have the I diphthong coming there. So you have a vowel repeating in 3 words. And this is an example for an assonance. So internal rhymes are brought about by elements like alliteration and assonance. Alliteration is a repetition of consonant sounds, and assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds. Now coming to the end rhyme, which is the most common rhyming scheme in modern poems, and it is based on the identical syllables at the end of certain lines. And to describe rhyme schemes, letters of alphabets are used to represent identical syllables at the ends of a line. That is something which you have done earlier. It's an exercise that probably you go through every time when you analyze rhyming scheme. You might delineate each line into A, B, B, A, A, B, A, B. You might have done this earlier. Your teacher might have asked you to find out the rhyme scheme of the poem. So this particular rhyme scheme, this particular type of rhyme is called end rhyme, and this is the most common rhyme that you confront with respect to modern poetry. Now let's try to analyze the third type of rhyme, which is I rhyme. I rhymes stand between the visual and the acoustic dimension of a poem. This is a bit tricky. Now you have to carefully analyze the words to understand what I rhyme is. Alright, so I rhymes stand between the visual and the acoustic dimension of a poem. The visual and acoustic dimension of a poem, playing with the spelling and the pronunciation of words. So this is how it appeals to the visual as well as the acoustic dimension. It plays with the spelling, which is the visual dimension, and the pronunciation, which is the acoustic dimension. And we have an example from Samuel Taylor Coleridge's famous poem Kubla Khan. The lines, let me read it. Then breathed the caverns measureless to man, and sank in tumult to a lifeless ocean. And mid this tumult Kubla heard from far ancestral voices prophesying war. So please look at the lines that you can find towards the bottom of the screen. The syllables "and" at the end of the first two lines are examples of I rhyme. You have the sequence of letters A and N is identical, but it is pronounced differently in two verses. Now, what you find are the words or the example for I rhyme that you have in this particular verse is man and ocean. So you have the same letters there, A and N, but there is a slight difference in the way you pronounce it. In man, you have the pronunciation man, and ocean, it's a bit different towards the end. You have the same letters, but you have different pronunciation. That is why I said earlier that it stands between the visual and the acoustic dimension. It might seem the letters are the same, but you have different pronunciations. Minor difference, minor variation in the pronunciation. I rhymes play with the reader's expectations. That is where I rhymes become significant, and it plays with the reader's expectations. Now, when reading the two lines in Coleridge's poem, one is tempted to pronounce the syllable "an" as in man and "ocean" in such a way that the two words rhyme. So possibly you might want to end up with an end rhyme. You might want to read man and ocean in the same way, but unfortunately there is a minor variation in the pronunciation. By the time one gets to the word ocean, however, it has become clear that they only rhyme visually and have to be pronounced differently. So this is why I rhymes play with the visual as well as the acoustic dimensions. Now you read the first line, which is then reach the caverns measureless to man, and then you go on to the second line, and probably you want to end up with an end rhyme, but unfortunately when you come to ocean, you understand that you don't pronounce it the same way as the last word in the previous line, which is man, ocean. There are differences. So finally, when you come to the word ocean, it becomes clear that these words rhyme only visually, and there is a slight difference in the pronunciation. And I rhymes permit authors to highlight certain words by creating a tension between visual and acoustic levels, and thus to direct the reader's attention to specific elements of the poem. So this is one purpose of incorporating I rhymes into poetry. It's difficult to identify these rhymes, but still, the poet employs it with a purpose. The poet employs these I rhymes with a purpose. When he wants the readers to focus on a particular word, and he wants to point out specific elements of his work of art, then he might use I rhymes, like in the words man and ocean. Alright, then let's come to the multitude of stanza forms that have been used throughout the ages. We have a few basic forms being described here by Mario Klarer. We have couplets, which means two verses, two lines. We have terces, which means three verses or three poetical lines. We even have quatrains, wherein which you will find four lines or four verses. And then Clara spends a while describing to us the sonnet form. And the sonnet form is a combination of different stanzas according to Mario Klarer. And the rhyming scheme of these stanzas depends upon the kind of stanza form that they have used. And according to the use of the various rhyme scheme and stanza forms, sonnet can be divided into Shakespearean, Spenserian, and the Italian. The Italian sonnet form is also called the Petrarchan sonnet form. So you have three different types of sonnets. You have Italian or Petrarchan sonnets, you have Shakespearean or English sonnets, and finally you have the Spenserian sonnets. And it's Petrarch who introduced the sonnet form. It's Thomas Wyatt and Surrey who introduced this form into English. And the English or Shakespearean sonnet is what has been dealt at length by Mario Klarer. There are 14 lines in a sonnet. I hope you remember that. I had said that in my previous session. It's an arrangement of stanzas and as well as the choice of rhyme scheme that makes it either Italian or Shakespearean or Spenserian. For example, in the Petrarchan version, you have the rhyming scheme ABBA, ABBA, CDE, CDE. This is the rhyme scheme that you have in the Petrarchan version. When you come to the Shakespearean sonnet, you have 14 lines in iambic pentameter and the following rhyme scheme is used: AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, GG. This is the rhyme scheme that you get when you go through a Shakespearean sonnet. So one thing that is common to all sonnets is that it has 14 lines. The way you arrange these 14 lines is what makes it Petrarchan, Shakespearean, or Spenserian. Now, if you keep all the 14 lines together and divide it into an octave and sestet, which means the first part which has an 8 lines and the second part which has a 6 lines, then you can call it a Petrarchan sonnet. And you'll have to stick on to the rhyme scheme which I said earlier: ABBA, ABBA, CDE, CDE. You'll have to stick on to this particular rhyming scheme if you want to write a Petrarchan sonnet. Now coming to Shakespearean sonnet, it has 14 lines and it's divided into uh, three quatrains, which gives us total of 12 lines, and finally you have a couplet. And that is why you have GG at the end of the rhyme scheme. The rhyme scheme of Shakespearean sonnet is AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, GG. So you have three quatrains and you have finally you have a couplet. So that is one type of sonnet that has been dealt at length by Mario Klarer. Then you also have the Spenserian version. Spenserian version is a bit different from the Shakespearean sonnet. The difference you find it only in the use of rhyme scheme. If Shakespearean sonnet employs ABAB, CD, EF, GG rhyme scheme, the Spenserian variety uses AB, BC, CD, EE. You have interconnected rhyme scheme in Spenserian variety. So that is what ends the genre called poetry in Mario Klarer's work, An Introduction to Literary Studies. That is where we stop for the day as well. So it's poetry that we have been discussing, or Mario Klarer have discussed in the first part. In the second part, he discusses drama. So that is all for today. Thank you so much for being with me.